She remembered that day with a vividness so sharp, it felt as though her memory had preserved a special reel of film, capturing every second in intricate detail. At that time, she was already carrying their third child, something neither she nor her husband knew yet. They only had a vague sense that a new miracle was quietly making its home within her. The first pregnancy had been a joyful whirlwind for both of them. Despite the unexpected expenses and lifestyle shifts, they had awaited their firstborn with glowing eyes and nervous anticipation. When their eldest daughter, Lily, was born, Mark, her husband, was overjoyed. Emily had felt certain that she had found the kind of life partner who would walk beside her through every joy and trial. The second pregnancy brought more challenges. Financial stress began to press in on them. Deadlines at work became unbearable, and their family started piling on expectations. But when their second child, a curious, bright-eyed little boy named Jonah, entered the world, their love for him seemed to mute all the noise. Together, they believed they could overcome anything. But the third pregnancy was different. The moment Emily sensed it, her first instinct was to tell Mark. She wanted to share the overwhelming sense of wonder bubbling inside her, this readiness to welcome another little life. But his reaction was not what she had expected. Instead of a warm embrace or the words, "We'll figure this out," she was met with irritation and quiet despair. Mark spoke of disaster, for their budget, their plans, his dream of a new car, and long overdue vacations. Emily stood there silently as he blamed her for not being more responsible, for throwing a wrench into their lives. He talked about crossing off every luxury from their list of wants, as if this baby were a punishment rather than a blessing. She had no words, because she hadn't expected a verdict. Not like this. Their marriage, like many, had its share of arguments and hard seasons. But this time was different. There was a distinct and aching sense of distance, as though something irreparable had cracked between them. Just yesterday, they were laughing together at their kids' antics and planning weekend outings. Now, Mark looked at her as if she were an enemy, the destroyer of his carefully curated dreams. He grew increasingly withdrawn, mumbling about how he was tired of carrying the load, even questioning why he had ever agreed to have more than one child. Emily stared at him, hardly recognizing the man she'd married. She wanted to reach him, to bring him back from whatever place he'd disappeared to, but found no words strong enough to bridge the widening gap. That evening, Mark shut himself in the spare bedroom under the pretense of urgent work. Emily sat at the kitchen table, drumming her fingers against the wood as an emotional storm swirled inside her. She began to feel like a mountain, alone and immovable, while at her base, two small children searched for comfort and safety. And at the summit, her thoughts twisted violently in the wind. She couldn't understand how it had come to this. Why had Mark chosen to act like this pregnancy was hers alone to bear? As if it had nothing to do with him. Days passed. Her growing belly became an undeniable symbol of coming change. But Mark kept his distance. In the mornings, he barely mumbled a greeting over coffee before heading to work with a sour face. In the evenings, he locked himself away or muttered complaints about how exhausted he was, how his head ached, how friends of his were already driving new cars while they could barely keep up with groceries and kids' clothing. Each of his grievances felt like a soft but steady knife to her back, never loud, but always painful. Emily tried to keep her worries hidden from the kids. They were still her brightest light. She took Lily to school and Jonah to daycare, helped with homework, listened to their stories, and made sure their little world stayed stable. Meanwhile, she kept working remotely, writing content, preparing reports for the small firm she'd freelanced with for years. That routine was exhausting, but it also gave her clarity. Everything depended on her now, and that meant she didn't have the luxury of falling apart. Then came a night when Mark began complaining again, this time about how much money was spent on food, on clothes for the kids, how she had ruined his future by being careless and stealing his chance at ever owning a car. Something inside her snapped. She looked at the man standing across the room and realized he wasn't doing anything to change their situation. Yes, he worked, but so did she. He came home expecting sympathy and service, while she spun like a hamster in a wheel, ensuring the kids were fed, the school fees paid, and the house halfway functional. The next morning, Mark dropped the bomb. He said he was tired of the stress and was thinking of leaving, claiming he didn't see a future anymore. He said it with a tone that implied Emily should fall to her knees, beg him to stay, promise she'd end the pregnancy, or do whatever it took to keep him. But she didn't want to promise anything. The pregnancy was too far along for that even to be a possibility. So she simply said, "If you want to leave, then go. Just don't come back later saying you've changed your mind." Mark didn't argue. He nodded, packed a suitcase in silence, and walked out the door. It might have looked to outsiders like she kicked him out, but Emily knew the truth. He had already left her long ago, emotionally and mentally. His actual departure was eerily simple. He just walked out, and she stood in the hallway, listening to the sounds of her children playing in the next room, blissfully unaware that their father had just abandoned them. She felt a swirl of emotions: shock, grief, a strange relief. Her first thought was this: she didn't have the right to give up. Carrying a third child while shouldering the weight of two more, the mortgage, and an uncertain future, it was terrifying. But surrender wasn't an option. She either moved forward or collapsed. And pity wouldn't feed anyone. That same day, she called her friend Rachel, asked for help picking up the kids, and sat down at her laptop, hunting for extra freelance gigs. A thought thudded in her mind like a drumbeat: we're on our own now. No one is coming to save us. When her third child was finally born, a tiny, warm bundle of life named Caleb, Emily felt something unexpected: peace. The world, despite everything, still held beauty. Another heartbeat now pulsed beside hers. Another soul she was responsible for, and in return, he gave her renewed purpose. Yes, the sleepless nights were brutal. Creating a feeding schedule, navigating maternity leave while still freelancing, it stretched her thin. But something within her had shifted. New reserves of strength seemed to awaken. She started actively seeking ways to increase her income from home, even venturing into areas she'd never considered before: digital marketing, basic design tools, copy editing. It was overwhelming at first, but with each step, she felt herself growing, not just surviving, but evolving. Slowly, life started settling into a new rhythm. Lily had become more independent at school and even helped with her little brothers. Jonah adjusted to the changes quicker than she expected, often surprising her with his maturity. And Caleb, though still a baby, brought laughter and joy to every room with his gurgles and tiny milestones. Emily pinched every penny, but she noticed something surprising: life without Mark was actually less expensive. Odd as it sounded, her income, even paired only with a small government benefit, was enough to cover essentials, quality food, and even enriching experiences for the kids. Gone were the constant expenditures for Mark's man cave projects, car parts, expensive meats, and random gadgets that lost his interest in days. Without his wants looming over every financial decision, Emily discovered something close to contentment. She didn't resent him anymore. She simply recognized a truth: life, even with its challenges, had become simpler without him. Her remote work began bearing fruit. Clients returned. Her small earnings became steadier. She started getting referrals and slowly built confidence in a field she'd once felt intimidated by. She poured herself into learning, improving, pushing for better projects. Each minor success felt like a building block in the new foundation she was laying. With every late-night email sent and report finished, she started to believe: I've got this. Sometimes, after the kids were asleep and the house finally quiet, she would catch herself wondering what Mark was doing. But the moment those thoughts tried to take root, she chased them away. She had no room in her life for regrets, not anymore. She remembered too well the hollow way he'd spoken about their future, how he'd looked at her pregnant belly and muttered, "Nothing good will come of this." That memory was enough to keep her focus forward. And as time moved on, the truth became impossible to ignore. She wasn't just doing fine without him, she was thriving. What once felt like crushing loneliness faded beneath the busyness of their new life. The kids' laughter, her calls with Rachel, and the purpose she found in her work filled the silence that Mark had once dominated with sighs and complaints. Instead of feeling abandoned, she felt free. Free from constant justifications. Free from needing to ask permission to buy shoes for the kids or spend an evening with friends. She realized she didn't miss his presence, only the version of him she had once hoped existed. Her 3 children continued to grow. Lily blossomed into a confident, smart girl who could whip up a snack for her brothers without being asked. Jonah was as curious as ever, always asking questions about how things worked, and little Caleb was beginning to take wobbly steps, gripping her fingers for support. With every day, Emily walked further from her old life and closer to the one she was building with her own 2 hands. New opportunities emerged. Rachel introduced her to a brilliant accountant who helped her sort through her paperwork and suggested she register her freelance work as a business. The idea felt terrifying at first, but the more she considered it, the more it made sense. Legal contracts, real clients, and better rates. She decided to take the leap. And it worked. Despite everything on her plate, Emily made time for what mattered most: her kids. She planned weekend outings to parks, museums, and even local art workshops. She wanted them to experience the world, to learn and grow and feel seen. She never wanted them to think their lives were lacking because their father had walked away. Quite the opposite, she wanted them to know joy, security, and the power of resilience. Eventually, a quiet kind of happiness began to bloom in her life. Not the explosive kind, but the steady, grounded type. She was living her life on her own terms, no longer reporting to anyone, no longer subject to someone else's moods or expectations. She wasn't required to explain why dinner wasn't ready at 6 or why she hadn't folded the laundry yet. If she had a headache, she didn't have to pretend everything was fine for the sake of someone else's comfort. Her children saw her, not just as mom, but as someone who worked, who created, who stood tall. And her heart swelled with pride, because she'd crawled out of a place of pain and confusion and found something stronger on the other side. Of course, not everything was smooth. There were nights she collapsed into bed, barely able to move. Days when money ran low and she had to stretch every dollar. She kept a spreadsheet of every expense, calculating exactly what she could afford, shaving off anything unnecessary. But even in those hard moments, she never once regretted her decision. At least now, she didn't have to babysit a grown man who sulked about his unfulfilled dreams while doing nothing to change them. She heard things about Mark now and then through mutual friends. He was floundering, switching jobs, then crawling back to his old one, complaining about the economy and how nothing ever went his way. He reached out to her once or twice, but the conversations were empty, full of vague accusations about how she didn't let him see the kids enough, how unfair it was that she had taken everything. But Emily knew the truth. He hadn't asked about the kids' health, their school progress, their happiness. He didn't offer financial help or time. And when she occasionally suggested he watch them for a few hours while she handled errands, he always had an excuse. He hadn't changed. And she didn't expect him to. So she stopped waiting. The less she thought about him, the more room she had in her mind for herself and for her children. One day, she decided it was time for something new. She dipped into her savings and planned a short trip. Nothing extravagant, just a drive down to a coastal town so the kids could feel the ocean breeze and see something different. She booked a small hotel, packed snacks and sunscreen, and hit the road with all 3 kids in the back seat. That weekend turned out to be magical. The splash of waves, melting ice cream cones, sandy shoes and laughter echoing across the boardwalk. Emily watched her kids play, their faces lit up by the joy of discovery. And in that moment, she realized something with aching clarity. Freedom was worth every single struggle it had taken to get here. She didn't feel sad without Mark. She felt unburdened. When they returned home from that coastal trip, sun-kissed and filled with new memories, Emily knew something had shifted in her spirit. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was creating a life. One with meaning. One that belonged entirely to her and her children. That was when she made her next big decision. She was going to buy a car. Not immediately, of course. It would take time. But the dream that she and Mark once talked about, the one he had declared impossible now, wasn't out of reach anymore. It was hers to claim. She began researching models, comparing prices, digging through user reviews. She even met with a financial advisor at her bank to discuss loans and credit options. It wasn't easy. The thought of taking on debt frightened her. After all, she had spent the last year clawing her way towards stability. But there was power in knowing that she could make this choice on her own. No one was stopping her now. No one rolling their eyes at the budget, scoffing at the idea of driving a used car instead of something flashy. This wasn't about luxury. It was about independence. She kept working. Every extra dollar she earned was tucked away in a special envelope labeled Freedom Fund. She skipped buying new clothes for herself. She canceled streaming subscriptions and cooked every meal at home. It wasn't glamorous, but every time she looked at that envelope, she felt stronger. And then, after months of saving and careful planning, the day finally arrived. She signed the paperwork at the dealership, her hands trembling slightly as she held the pen. The salesperson handed her the keys, and Emily stood there for a moment, staring at them as if they were made of gold. This wasn't just a car, it was proof. Proof that she had survived the storm and built something better with her own hands. When she sat behind the wheel and turned the ignition, a wave of emotion washed over her. She was driving her kids to school now, to the grocery store, to doctor's appointments, without relying on public buses, without borrowing favors. They could take day trips when they wanted. Visit the zoo. Explore nature trails. She could say yes to life more often. One afternoon, as she drove through the center of town, The sun low and golden through the windshield. She stopped at a red light. That's when she saw him. Mark. He was standing on the corner, clutching plastic bags from a discount store, his coat hanging loosely from his shoulders. He looked thinner, paler. His posture was slouched, defeated. Emily's heart didn't race. It didn't break. It didn't even ache. He saw her too. Their eyes met for a split second, and in that moment, she saw everything she needed to. Regret, confusion, maybe even envy. But she felt nothing but calm. A quiet smile formed on her lips, not mocking, just peaceful. She gently pressed the gas and drove on. In those few seconds, something closed. Something healed. She understood more in that fleeting glance than in all the arguments they'd ever had. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't mourning the man who had left. Because she had grown beyond him. Her life had become hers alone. The days that followed moved in steady, fulfilling rhythm. There were still challenges, doctor visits, school meetings, spilled juice, late-night tears. But they were her challenges, and she met them with resolve. Each morning, she woke up not wondering how Mark would treat her that day, but thinking about what tasks she needed to accomplish, what fun she could squeeze into the evenings, how to stretch their budget while still buying Jonah a new set of markers or letting Lily choose a book at the store. Her children continued to thrive. Lily had become more than a big sister. She was Emily's helper, her sounding board, her daily dose of hope. Jonah, ever curious, asked a million questions about the world. He wanted to know how clouds worked, why some frogs were poisonous, what made rainbows bend. And Caleb, tiny Caleb, had begun running, his legs wobbly but determined, his laughter echoing through every room like a promise that life was still full of light. Emily no longer felt the urge to prove herself to anyone. She wasn't living in comparison to her past or waiting for acknowledgement from the man who once stood beside her. She bought the kids what they needed, paid for their activities. She even managed to set money aside each month for future vacations. The more she trusted herself, the more confident she became in her ability to lead this family. Sometimes, she thought back to those old conversations when Mark told her she didn't know how to plan a family, when he made her feel small for wanting another child. She could remember the exact tone of his voice, the impatient flick of his hand, the way he always turned their life together into a ledger of complaints. And yet, now she could recall those memories with a smile. Not because they were pleasant, but because they were gone. She had emerged from that version of herself, the one who pleaded, who tiptoed, who begged for understanding, and stepped into a new identity. One where she no longer waited for help. One where silence in the house didn't feel oppressive but peaceful. Where laughter didn't need permission. Where spending money on a school field trip or a better winter coat didn't come with guilt or a lecture. Even the simplest things had changed. Now, when she needed something from the top shelf of the pantry, she didn't wait 3 days for someone to get around to it. She stood on a stool or asked Lily or Jonah. They weren't so little anymore. And Emily couldn't help but chuckle, thinking of the way Mark used to hold every minor favor over her like a crown, as if lifting a box or taking out the trash made him a hero. No, not anymore. This home now held peace. Gentle chaos, yes, Caleb's toys scattered across the floor, homework papers on the counter, spaghetti sauce on the high chair. But it was the kind of chaos she welcomed. It was the sound of love, of effort, of joy. No more sulking, no more passive-aggressive comments, no more draining lectures about how hard life is. And somehow, all of it had started the day she realized she was pregnant with Caleb. A day that began with fear and ended up being her turning point. It was strange, looking back, how something so painful, so initially devastating, had ended up being the very thing that set her free. That third pregnancy, once branded a catastrophe by the man who walked away, had opened a new path. A path that led not just to survival, but to strength, stability, and something close to joy. Emily no longer viewed her life in terms of what she'd lost. She saw it in terms of what she'd gained. She'd gained confidence, the kind that only comes from walking through fire and making it out with your spirit intact. She'd gained clarity about the kind of environment her children needed to grow, one filled with love, encouragement, and freedom to be exactly who they were. And perhaps most of all, she'd gained ownership over her own life. She made the decisions now. She created the rules. She chose how to spend money, how to spend time, and how to shape the future of the little family she was raising alone, but never lonely. The bitterness had drained away over time, washed out slowly by bedtime stories, packed lunches, snowball fights, and spontaneous dance parties in the living room. The hole Mark left had filled itself with laughter, hard work, and an ever-growing bond between her and her kids. And though she didn't talk about him much anymore, his memory sometimes resurfaced. Usually when she least expected it, like during parent-teacher conferences, when other dads showed up with coffees in hand. Or at birthday parties, when other kids had two parents snapping photos and singing along. She'd feel a twinge then, not of regret, but of a quiet, aching sadness that her children had been left without that second anchor. But she never let that sadness stay long, because it wasn't her burden to carry. Mark had made his choice. He had chosen escape over effort, distance over presence. And in doing so, he'd handed her a hard, brutal kind of freedom, the kind no one asks for, but once received, shapes everything that follows. Emily's world was now built on small victories. Some days, it was just getting all three kids dressed and out the door on time. Other days, it was winning a new client or finishing a freelance project that paid more than expected. She celebrated each win, no matter how minor, because every win was earned. She had developed a kind of inner rhythm. Wake early, get the kids ready, juggle meetings during Caleb's naps, run errands between pickups, prep dinner while checking school emails, and squeeze in client work after bedtime. It was exhausting, yes, but it was also hers. And the more she thrived, the more she began to notice the ripple effects. Lily, once sensitive to tension in the house, had blossomed into a confident preteen who took pride in helping her mom. Jonah had started a science club at school, often coming home bursting with facts about insects, space, or whatever topic had caught his attention that week. And Caleb, her wild little toddler, was now stringing together words, chasing his siblings down the hallway, and making every stranger smile at the grocery store. Her home wasn't perfect. The carpet had stains. The couch had a tear from a failed art project. The sink was rarely empty, but it was filled with music, motion, and meaning. There were times when Emily wished someone could see how far she'd come. Not for praise, but to witness the arc of it all. To say, you did it. But most days, she said it to herself. And that was enough. She stopped measuring her worth against other families or Instagram perfect moments. She no longer compared her life to her friends' two-parent households. Because comparison was a thief, and she had fought too hard to let anything steal her peace again. And peace, she realized, was not the absence of chaos, but the presence of purpose. That purpose became even clearer the day she received a message from Mark. It was short, like most of his attempts to reconnect. A vague, passive-aggressive inquiry about his kids, cloaked in self-pity and subtle blame. He wanted to know why she never made time for him to be involved. He mentioned missing them. Missing what they had. Emily stared at the message for a long time. There was a time she would have cried, would have felt torn, angry, obligated to explain herself. But not anymore. Now, she saw the message for what it was, another attempt to pull her into a spiral of guilt and resentment. But she'd built her life too carefully to let it be disturbed by someone who had willingly abandoned it. So she didn't reply. She didn't lash out. She didn't engage. She simply deleted the message and returned to her evening routine. Jonah was asking for help building a volcano for a school project. Lily needed her opinion on a book she was reading, and Caleb had just spilled his juice all over the kitchen floor. And that, she thought, was where she belonged. Not in the past. Not in another argument. But here, in the mess and magic of now. The next weekend, she took the kids to a nature preserve outside the city. They hiked a short trail, stopping every few minutes to look at squirrels, collect rocks, or marvel at butterflies. Emily brought sandwiches, juice boxes, and a blanket. They sat under a tree, the sun filtering through the leaves, and shared stories and snacks until Caleb fell asleep on her lap. As she looked at her children, so full of life, questions, and dreams, she felt something bloom inside her. A quiet, resolute joy. Not the kind that needed to be announced or photographed, but the kind that hummed softly in her chest, reminding her that this life, this imperfect, beautiful, hard-earned life was hers. She didn't need anyone to complete it. She had already completed herself. Time kept moving, and with it, so did Emily. Her days remained full, sometimes overwhelmingly so, but they no longer felt like survival. They were movement, growth, intention. She had routines, she had backup plans, she had spreadsheets and sticky notes and a drawer full of snacks for last-minute school projects. Her calendar was color-coded, her deadlines were met, and her kids were thriving. More than once, someone would say to her, "I don't know how you do it," with a note of admiration or disbelief. Emily would smile, shrug, and say something modest, but inside, she knew exactly how she did it. She chose to. Every single day. What used to feel like pressure now felt like progress. She no longer replayed old arguments in her mind. She stopped questioning if she could have saved her marriage or done things differently. Those thoughts used to haunt her in the quiet moments, when the kids were asleep and she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. But now, she filled those quiet spaces with dreams of what was still ahead. She started setting long-term goals. Not just financial ones, but personal ones. She wanted to grow her business, maybe hire someone part-time to help. She wanted to take the kids on a real vacation, maybe to Colorado or even California. She wanted to learn something new for herself, just because she could. She started reading again. At night, instead of scrolling through her phone until her eyes ached, she opened books, real books, and let her mind wander into other worlds. She started running short distances in the mornings while